All right, it's 2 minutes after the hour, so I think we can begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicholas Herman. I'm the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Peter Emanuel Diamond, who will be speaking to us about the digital Beehive, wonderful project. And before I get to his introduction, I want to tell you about some exciting events that the Schoenberg Institute is conducting in the next little while. I think the most interesting one for many of you who are regulars at our monthly virtual lectures is the fact that next month in November, instead of having a virtual lecture, of course, annually we have the Schoenberg Symposium for Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age, and this year is no exception. So from November 16th to 18th, we'll be holding both in person in Philadelphia and also via Zoom online, the 16th annual Schoenberg Symposium. And our theme this year is the image of the book, representing the codex from antiquity to the present, with a wonderful list of speakers, some fun special events as well as part of the proceedings, including reception on the evening of November 17th to celebrate the 10th anniversary of SIMS, which was founded in 2013. So look out for that. We will post some links in the chat. I think Dot's already done so. And that's next month from November 16th to November 18th. We also have a big announcement that we made a couple of weeks ago regarding our journal, Manuscript Studies, which is now entering its 9th year as an in-print and online journal. Comes out twice a year. And we're really excited to announce that as of next year, as of 2024, the journal will be fully open access, which means that from day one, articles published in the journal will be available free of charge to anyone. And we're very excited about this announcement. We hope it'll convince many of you to read and indeed to contribute content to our journal. We publish peer-reviewed articles, shorter annotations, and book reviews. So look out for the journal, and starting next year, available free of charge as of publication. I also, of course, want to give a shout out to my wonderful colleague, Dot Porter's weekly event, Coffee with a Codex, which happens every Thursday at noon Eastern Standard Time, a half-hour informal drop-in session where you can see Dot and sometimes special guests manipulate and look at a manuscript from our collections at Penn, and on special occasions also collections elsewhere. So do sign up to that if you're interested. And finally, Dot and our speaker, Peter Diamond, will be co-conducting an in-person workshop as part of the Price Lab for Digital Humanities program next week, Tuesday, the 31st, at Penn at 3 p.m. In Williams Hall 623. And the workshop is entitled Digital Collections, Where to Begin. So keep an eye out for that. All right, so with those announcements out of the way, it's my pleasure today to introduce Peter Emanuel Diamond, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. His dissertation studies the influence of European pastoral literature on early American legal, political, and religious thought. He's currently an Andrew W. Mellon mid-doctoral fellow at Penn's Price Lab for Digital Humanities. And he's the project manager of the Digital Beehive project, which is an effort to annotate the digitized manuscript of Francis Daniel Pastorius's Commonplace book. And this project, of course, is the basis of the talk he will be giving to us this afternoon. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick. I want to thank the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies for inviting me to present this work. And thanks to Lynn Ransom, to Nick Herman, to Dot Porter, everyone at SIMS who have been so supportive of the Digital Beehive. I've worked on. Oh, I think. All right, I've worked on. I think someone maybe. unmuted in a way that's causing an echo. I'm not sure
I'm
if
not sure if
I might try to mute everyone and
It's muted, but I did something to your spotlight and that's when it, so I'll just leave it as is.
perfect. Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. So I've worked on digital annotations for the manuscript that we're discussing today for the past year with an all-star team. Doug Emery and John Pollock have fearlessly overseen the digital Beehive for years now, and I worked closely on annotations with the incomparable Jesse Dummer and Maya Novak-Kogdel. I also, I'll be sharing my screen in just a moment. I also had the benefit of picking this project up after much progress had been made and digital infrastructures had been built by previous project managers and student workers, including Mariah Min, Lindsay Van Tyne, and especially Jenna Lewis and David Nelson. The Kislak Center, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and the Price Lab for Digital Humanities have given tremendous support to the digital Beehive. And in addition to sharing some of my own scholarship today, I'm excited that this lecture will serve as a sort of premiere for work that all of those people and groups have contributed to over the years. And on that note, I will share my screen and begin. Right, so this talk is about Francis Daniel Pastorius, who's the attorney, poet, and humanist intellectual who moved from Germany to Pennsylvania in the early 1980s with a charter from William Penn to found what is now the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. As many scholars before me have noted, an account of Pastorius and his literary output is a story that teeters or transitions between atavism and progressivism, and also a story that teeters or transitions between the exacting moral rigor of early American Protestantism and a sort of pluralistic mentality, because Pastorius was dedicated to representing various viewpoints and to privileging diverse knowledge over ideological singularity. The text at the center of our conversation today is The Beehive, which is an extensive manuscript commonplace book that Pastorius wrote during the final decades of his life in Philadelphia in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. We will talk a little bit about the practice of commonplacing and Pastorius's position in that early modern intellectual tradition. We will consider the ways in which the Beehive is an exemplar of the commonplace tradition, but also the ways in which Pastorius departed from or even revolutionized the form of organizing knowledge. To have this conversation, we will consult the digital Beehive, which is an accessible online resource for navigating and learning about Pastorius's manuscript. Once we feel comfortable with some of the basic questions like who was Pastorius, what is commonplacing, what's in the digital Beehive, and how and why was the manuscript digitized and annotated, we will then transition to a related set of questions about why studying this little red manuscript is important both for understanding the complex political, ideological, religious, and literary life of Pastorius, and further still, why spending some time thinking about the formal complexity of the Beehive and understanding the anatomy of its digital companion might have some larger implications for how we think about a host of topics in the history of ideas and the history of early America, to which Pastorius remains silently central. These include the influence of Pietism, the German Protestant movement in which Pastorius was a key character, on religious and political formations in Pennsylvania and in America more broadly that continue to shape our culture. Finally, we will pay attention to the roles of literature and literary analysis on Pastorius's experimental commonplacing. I will argue that Pastorius's generally expansive humanism and his enthusiasm for a variety of literatures positions him as once representative of and at odds with the Pietist traditions that he's come to represent. These traditions and the tensions therein are directly reflected in the way that Pastorius innovates commonplacing, and in turn in the ways that we who work on the digital Beehive have annotated and presented the manuscript digitally. So just to begin, I'll show you, this is an image that I took on, I think, my first day in the Kislak reading room working on the manuscript. So that's how it looks in its current form. Some of the identifiers that I've used here so far, Pastorius, pietism, commonplacing, may be unfamiliar to some people here. So I want to spend the first part of today's lecture on the backstory and on some key vocabulary. I don't intend to cover the entire history of pietism in Philadelphia, but rather to give some select details that supply context for a reading of Pastorius's own innovations and quarrels, one that is grounded in a study of the manuscript itself. So first, some history. The Pietist movement is said to officially have begun in Frankfurt during the 1670s and 80s, yet recent historical and theological studies of Pietism have suggested that we understand the Pietist movement as the product of a longer, ongoing, and often mystical protest against the tendency of Lutheranism toward a more outward focus on scripture and institutionalized practices, including Luther's own belief that lay readers should look to the Catechism rather than to the complete Bible as scripture. This claim that we should appreciate a wider historical and contemporary context for the reformist innovations of Pietism has been advanced and synthesized recently in the scholarship of Douglas Shantz, whose synthetic and introductory histories of Pietism were most useful in shaping this first portion of the lecture. The externalizing elements of Luther's Reformation prompted immediate protest movements. Most famous in Luther's lifetime, perhaps, was the falling out of Luther and the theologian Caspar Schwenkfeld von Ossig, who argued that Luther's insistence on sacraments and on other material signs of faith was in direct conflict with the aim toward comprehensive ethical and spiritual self-betterment. For Schwenkfeld von Ossig, practices like the Eucharist restricted immersive spiritual experience to momentary engagements with material signs, a feature that was at odds with humans' more complete and everyday capacity to access the presence of Christ. That 16th century theologian wrote in opposition to Luther that everyday practices of living, practices that could be reached through meditation or even through the application of scripture to one's own actions and choices, comprised an ethical and sustainable means of accessing Christ day to day. This belief system, replacing the externalizing rituals of Lutheran practice with internalizing faith in the human capacity to achieve salvation through self-study and spiritual transformation, also motivated much early modern alchemy. Alchemists believed in both the human's ability to achieve salvation on earth and on the value of studying the Bible and the book of nature together in the interest of deepening one's connections with the Christian faith. The figure who most importantly bridged early modern alchemy with Schwenkfeldian tenets of realizing and enacting faith in everyday life was Johann Arndt, who in 1610 wrote the books of True Christianity. According to Shantz, Arndt's 1610 book quickly became the most popular work in the history of German Protestant publications. Lay readers flocked to Arndt's adaptation of biblical stories to address quotidian challenges and experiences, as well as to Arndt's decision to bring together imagery from the Bible and imagery from nature. 4 books was so popular that 95 German editions and 28 foreign language editions existed by the end of the 18th century, including an English translation from 1646 that was later printed by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1751. One of Arndt's admirers was Philipp Jakob Spina, who you see on the screen now, a preacher and theologian who, in 1666, was named chief Lutheran minister in Frankfurt, Germany. Armed with an advanced knowledge of the history of protests of Lutheranism that had come before him, and with his own conviction that greater attention to moral life was needed within Protestantism, Spina sought to radicalize Arndt's critiques. Once heterodox Lutherans of Frankfurt observed the level of piety emerging from an individualist engagement of scripture that seemed to extend beyond the tropological and into the quotidian, conventicles began to form in Spina's parish, which marked a literal and spatial transition that took critiques of the institutionalized Lutheran practices to an extreme level. By the early 1670s, groups of Spina's followers began to meet in spaces like homes for Bible studies that were at once erudite and deeply personalized and self-directed. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Spina. That was Arndt on the previous page. I apologize for that. So this is Spina, and in his 1675 book, Pious Desires, he himself codified many of the qualities of his rebellious parish by outlining guidelines for an emergent religious movement. These guidelines included the aforementioned study of the Bible by lay people within private meetings, and even more radically, a rejection of hierarchical priesthood in favor of the universal priesthood of the laity. Spina also proposed in the book that preaching should appeal to the listener's innermost faith. In short, his proposals gave unprecedented license to lay believers in the spheres of biblical interpretation, church governance, and overall agency in their own spiritual transformations. So some date the founding of Pietism to the publication of Pious Desires. Others perhaps more aptly noting that religious transitions typically lack a punctual origin, observe Pietism as emerging from the gradual expansion of these beliefs beyond Spina in a broader community within Frankfurt, as well as other German cities like Leipzig and Halle. This wider network of believers who adopted Pietist beliefs in the late 17th century transformed Spina's principles toward more totalizing and quietist means, advocating a singular collapsing of the religious and secular realms at the expense of worldly and civic engagement, such that people now often associate Pietism with a level of ascesis that Spina would have never anticipated. One of Spina's other principles laid out in this book was kindness to unbelievers, one of several features that united Pietists with the coeval religious movement of the Quakers. As we'll discuss today, there was much mutual admiration between some major Pietist and Quaker figures. In fact, a certain English Quaker traveled to Frankfurt in 1677 and visited the Saalhof, which refers to the buildings where the Frankfurt Pietist community primarily gathered at this time. The Quaker joined in the Pietists' practice of worship for the duration of his visit. As you may know or have guessed, this English Quaker visitor was William Penn, just 4 years before King Charles II granted him the charter for the land that became Pennsylvania. During his time at the Saalhof, Penn told the Pietists he met about his holy experiment that he was planning, proposing that the Pietists become one of the groups of persecuted dissenters to join him in his migration. This encounter between Penn and the Pietists prompted some of the Frankfurt group to organize the Frankfurt Land Company in the following years, a formal operation aimed to legally secure land in the forthcoming Pennsylvania colony, specifically for German dissenters. The company negotiated for the ownership of 15,000 acres of land in Pennsylvania to be administered by one of the attorney members of the Saalhof. That attorney was the star of today's show, Francis Daniel Pastorius. So I'll note here that one of the sources of knowledge today about the interaction between Penn and the Pietists is, in fact, the handwritten account in the Beehive of Pastorius's migration to America in 1683. So even before the general orientation to the Beehive manuscript that I will soon provide, I want to dive right into the manuscript at the center of today's lecture by reading you a passage. So we'll soon learn more about the sections of this vast commonplace book, but I'll note here that Pastorius narrates when he first learned of William Penn and his ultimate migration to North America. Pastorius was not in the Saalhof when Penn arrived. He was on a tour of Europe, but he does narrate his initial learning about Penn in a section of the Beehive called the Pastorian genealogy, a genealogy following through the Pastorius family tree up to the lawyer's arrival in Pennsylvania. And in the image you see here, which is a literal family tree from this section of the Beehive, it begins in Pastorius's hand, but is actually continued by his descendants into the later 18th century, with additional generations of the Pastorius family noted here in other people's handwriting at the bottom. So we'll speak soon about how Pastorius envisioned the futurity of his commonplace book as a tool for future generations. This is also then an appropriate place for me to note that Jaco Pastorius, the late bassist from the Weather Report, who also played with Joni Mitchell, is actually our subject's distant descendant, although the Pastorius family tree in the manuscript was not continued into the 20th century. So now I will read from the genealogy. So Pastorius, in this kind of entry, beginning with his name underlined, is how most of these autobiographical entries throughout the family tree appear. So Pastorius begins by telling us a bit about himself, after cataloging detailed biographical entries for many members of previous generations of his family. So we begin with Pastorius's childhood and education, then learn about his career in law a little bit, and then his travels, and then the day he first learned about Penn's holy experiment, and then his experience sailing to the Americas. So here he's writing about himself variously in third and first person. So Francis Daniel Pastorius was born at Sommerhausen in Frankenland the 26th of September between 1 and 2 o'clock in 1651, and had, after the Lutheran fashion for my godfathers, Franciscus, Semperfy of Limburg, and Daniel Gehling, clothed me in red scarlet, giving me also a little sword, a hat with 3 plumes of feathers, and a pair of white boots, making a fool of me even in my tenderest years, end quote. So first of all, the thought that Pastorius initially portrays himself as a small German boy with a feathered hat and a tiny sword is adorable, and this prose is indicative of the humorous specificity and detail that we find throughout Pastorius's writing. I think in Anthony Grafton's article on Pastorius, the first sentence is, Pastorius loved jokes. So he goes on, I'm skipping around a bit. In Winsheim, that's the historic town in Bavaria where Pastorius was educated, quote, I had a good schooling, mostly 20 or more young earls, baronets, and noble children for schoolfellows, there being an excellent rector at the gymnasium, referring here to the elite secondary school system that provided a rigorous education in the humanities and in ancient and modern languages to young men like Pastorius, himself the son of a wealthy lawyer who'd been the mayor or burgomaster of Winsheim. That's his father, Melchior Adam Pastorius. So Pastorius goes on to discuss his travels, his education in law, and his early career, and his acquisition of languages like Low Dutch, English, and French, and eventually his 2-year tour in the early 1680s when he accompanied a nobleman to serve as his tutor. And then here comes from the following page of Pastorius's genealogy. So he writes, quote, in 1680, the 26th of June, I, upon the recommendation of Dr. Spina, that brave patriarch of the Pietists, undertook to be a conductor or guide to a noble young spark in his travels through Holland, England, France, and Switzerland, and so went to Mentz where we did meet, and happily perform our voyage, as does appear by a peculiar manuscript journal of mine. Arriving again at Frankfurt in perfect health, safety, the 18th of November, 1682. And forasmuch as I, after this my return, was glad to enjoy the ancient familiarity of my former acquaintances, especially of those Christian friends who frequently assembled in a house called the Saalhof, Dr. Spina, Dr. Schutz, Notarius Fenda. Here he mentions just a long list of well-known pietists, then continues, quote, who sometimes made mention of William Penn and of Pennsylvania, and moreover communicated unto me as well as some private letters from Benjamin Furley, here referring to another English Quaker who joined Penn on his ministerial journey, as also printed relation concerning the province, and finally, the whole secret could not be withholden from me, that they purchased 15,000 acres of land in this remote part of the world, some of them entirely resolved to transport themselves, families, and all. This begat such a desire in my soul to continue in their society, and with them to lead a quiet, godly, and honest life in a howling wilderness, which I observed to be a heavy task for any to perform among the bad examples and numberless vanitates vanitatum in Europe. And that last Latin phrase is the Vulgate translation of Ecclesiastes, O vanity of vanities. So somehow, although Pastorius called the purchase of land here by the Frankfurt Company a secret that had been kept from him during his 2 years of travel through Europe, he soon found himself the administrator of the endeavor, and that would result in the founding of Germantown, Philadelphia. Reading this passage, Patrick Urban has noted that the reference to all these pietists buzzing about William Penn and Benjamin Furley demonstrates that, quote, the community of pietists at the Saalhof in Frankfurt had become the conduits of news of the colony, and Penn's printed tract and his personal image were thus enhanced by the local communities of pious sympathizers, advancing Urban's argument that Penn was becoming, quote, a veritable early modern rock star in the eyes of German-speaking dissenters, as his message of religious liberty particularly resonated in their region. But I'm also struck here by the way that Pastorius is moved not just by the idealistic message espoused by Penn, but also by the very nature of possible retreat in the author's fantasy of the Americas, a kind of Horatian retirement. This passage, which follows an overview of Pastorius's numerous travels and his legal career, now refers to the possibility of a new chapter in an unfamiliar territory, quote, to lead a godly and honest life in a howling wilderness. Of course, the depiction of the Americas as a wilderness and the notion that leaving Europe for North America can be an ethical retreat or an escape from the vanity of vanities back home from form a familiar colonial discourse. That said, the nature of Pastorius's colonial vision, or the question of whether he believed his role in settling Pennsylvania was an explicitly political and civic duty versus a quietist retreat and a displacement of the soul from the land of luxury to the so-called wilderness, is one that remains pressing in the study of Pastorius, in part because his writing reveals both an epic and triumphalist attitude toward the colonization of Pennsylvania and a persistent pietist quietism that influences his portrayal. So, there. The lawyer, as he writes in his genealogy, quote, went aboard a ship which had the name of America, the captain whereof was Joseph Wasey, and being gone the 6th of June from Gravesend, arrived on the 7th at Deal, then left England the 10th of the month of June, then saw the 16th of August this new world, arriving the 18th in the Bay of Delaware, and the 20th at Philadelphia, end quote. When he embarked on this journey with a smaller than expected handful of pietists, but also a number of German Quakers and Mennonites, and an even larger population of Dutch dissenters following him, did he view himself as Aeneas settling Rome, or as a retired husband seeking a small haven to study, write, and pray? The Beehive makes both options available to us in possibly contradictory ways. But by taking a look at both the content and form of a few select parts of this large commonplace manuscript, we can come to understand Pastorius as a civically engaged, presentist and progressive figure who innovated the solitary and outdated practices of commonplacing to develop modes of writing and thought that were useful to colonial knowledge production, such as the encyclopedic mode. The Beehive is not just a solitary commonplace project. It's a large-scale encyclopedic effort to catalog and make sense of new spiritual and political formations, while trying also to make sense of the role that Christian ethics, humanism, and Protestant ascesis can play in a massive colonial enterprise. So now that we've begun to explore the Beehive manuscript and have arrived at some hypotheses about how the manuscript's form might teach us about Pastorius's aims and his world in general, let's get a bit more acquainted with the basic anatomy of this massive commonplace book by consulting the digital interface that we've developed to make the manuscript accessible and in parts annotated. So here's the homepage of the digital Beehive, which is hosted on GitHub and is publicly available. I'll make sure at the end that it's sent to everyone in the chat here today. I've regularly categorized the Beehive as a commonplace book while noting that it's both exemplary and exceptional within the humanist tradition of commonplacing. Commonplacing is likely a familiar term to most of us, but to those who may be unfamiliar, commonplacing is a practice of compiling knowledge from various sources and creating a systematic compendium of sorts. Commonplace books often consist of collecting and excerpting passages on a vast range of topics from ancient as well as contemporary authorities to serve learning and scholarship. Typical commonplace books have a sense of order, for example, by using an alphabetical system of ordering entries as well as an alphabetical index. Commonplace books are most often associated with the European humanist tradition of early modern Europe, when figures beginning with Erasmus and then extending to John Locke and John Milton produced commonplace books of their own. Material that Pastorius writes out or excerpts in the Beehive include inscriptions, epitaphs, proverbs, poetry, biblical citations, theological citations, quotations from various ancient and contemporary figures, a list of books that Pastorius read or knew, copies of letters, and notes on science, useful herbs, and other plants. Pastorius began writing the Beehive in 1696, about 13 years after he first arrived in Philadelphia. On the very first page of the manuscript, he writes a sort of mission statement, quote, "For as much as our memory is not capable to retain all remarkable words, phrases, sentences, or matters of moment, which we do hear and read, it becomes every good scholar to have a commonplace book, and therein to treasure up whatever deserves his notice, and to the end that he may readily know both whether to dispose and insert each particular, as also whereupon occasion to find the same again, he ought to make himself an alphabetical index like that of the Beehive. And seeing it is the largest of my manuscripts, which I in my riper years did gather out of excellent English authors, my desire, last will, and testament is that my two sons, John Samuel and Henry Pastorius, shall have my writing to themselves and their heirs forever, and not to part with them for anything in this world, but rather to add thereunto some of their own." So we see here that for Pastorius, commonplacing was both a matter of private, personal, and scholarly record keeping, and also a social enterprise, most pressingly as a resource for his sons who wouldn't be able to receive the rich humanities education that he did. I'd add that both the private and social dimensions of commonplacing appear even more significant when we study the Beehive more fully and when we place the book in the context of Pastorius's faith. Pastorius was, in many ways, the product of a reformist movement that promoted individualism, quietism, and personal improvement through worship. But Pastorius also seemed to achieve a sense of wonder and virtue through the study of texts beyond the Bible, even contemporary literature, and especially contemporary English literature. Spinner's model of worship in conventicles and the presence of places like the Saalhof indicate that Pastorius's social world was far removed from the anti-intellectualism with which people often associate evangelical individualism today. Pastorius extended the pietist insistence on the individual study of the Bible to grant a sort of holiness to the general study of diverse knowledges. He ends the section about the purpose of this manuscript with a meditation that you can see at the bottom of the page here on Proverbs 16:16 and Job 28:16-18. Quote, because, and he writes, because the prize of wisdom is above rubies and cannot be valued with the precious onyx or on sapphire, and to get understanding is rather to be chosen than silver or gold, end quote. So Pastorius was invested in both the political and metaphysical effects of his commonplace book. But his prefatory writing also addresses some material properties and writerly decisions that are linked to how we understand the broader importance of this text. Now, Pastorius clearly rewrote his prefatory pages multiple times and variously added new title pages, but some references throughout the manuscript suggest that what is page 55 of the completed Beehive was his original title page. So I'll read to you another description of Pastorius's pursuit from that page, which pays close attention to the questions of language and of the material text. Pastorius begins by noting the many languages in which he, a polyglot and well-traveled writer with a gymnasium education that emphasized language learning, had already compiled proverbs and other excerpts, including Low Dutch, French, Italian, and Latin, as well as his native German. But he goes on to write, quote, "For the better learning of the English, and that my two sons, who probably will never attain the understanding of said languages, might hereafter have some of their father's steps, thereby to be guided to the same diligence and assiduity of picking the best out of good writings. I endeavored at spare times to make this present hive on a quire of fine paper, which a friend of mine, Jacob Tellner, departing for Europe, did give me. And when all over filled up with honeycombs, I was constrained to enlarge my hive with more coarser, homely, and homespun stuff of this country product. Thus I leave it for the perusing of those whom it was contrived in the first beginning thereof. Nevertheless, if any other besides them should happen to be benefited by these miscellanies, it will not be sad, but glad my heart." So that is to say that Pastorius endorses this event right now. So as Brooke Palmieri has noted, this preface demonstrates two topics that were interestingly on our author's mind when he endeavored to write the Beehive. The first is the material realities related to the availability of paper in Pennsylvania. Pastorius had only a limited availability, or a limited amount of fine paper acquired in Europe. So he soon found himself sourcing homespun paper from Germantown. In fact, from the paper mill of William Rittenhouse, whose descendant David is the namesake for Philly's Rittenhouse Square. The second element of this preface that is worth noting here is Pastorius's elevation of literature in English as a suitable subject for close scholarly attention, which is to say his decision to commonplace English texts with a level of humanistic rigor often reserved for classics and the Bible. At the end of this lecture, we will discuss how both the conditions, limited availability of paper, and Pastorius's unusual attention to recent English literatures become important considerations for how the Beehive is both composed and organized. But let's start by understanding exactly what is in this gigantic book. So the Beehive itself contains likely well over 1,000 pages in folio. We at Penn have a version of the manuscript bound in the mid-20th century in an almost deceptively well-preserved codex, which contains about 940 pages, but it's obvious that many of Pastorius's original pages are missing. In addition to the commonplace book, we know from Pastorius's preface that indexing was central to his strategy for commonplacing, and we at Penn indeed possess Pastorius's octavo index too, as a separate volume. So when you log on to the digital Beehive, you can find every extant page of the manuscript under contents. Although we divide the commonplace book into volume 1 and volume 2, it's worth noting that that's not reflective of Pastorius's decisions. Rather, that's how the manuscript was bound in, I believe, the 1940s or 50s in 2 hardcover volumes that you too can call up if you ever come to the 6th floor of Van Pelt Library. And then there's also the Octavo Index, which is the 3rd volume. So the author organized his original commonplace book in sections, and these sections had different formats and different topics, but are rather hard to navigate in the original manuscript. Some are dispersed rather than held together in one single part of the book, and the sections are packed together very densely for reasons that include Pastorius's constant awareness of the limitations of paper and his hesitance to ever leave any blank space on a page to come back to later. So one of the key features of the digital Beehive is that users can navigate a clickable interactive table of contents. You see the beginning of it on the left bar of the screen now, which brings you to the pages under whichever section of the manuscript that you choose. And separately, to learn about these sections and what you'll find there, users can read summaries of many of the major sections. There's simply too many sections for me to go over right now, but I'll say some of my favorites, which include a list of recreations of emblems that Pastorius encountered in his many travels. That's called the emblematical recreations. There's also a list of so-called onomastical symbols in prose in which Pastorius identifies his own initials within phrases and passages of divine and epic episodes, ranging from the crucifixion of Jesus Christ to the arrival of Aeneas in Rome, as if to imagine some kind of inexplicable connection between the most powerful movements of history and literature and his own personal, even interiorizing enterprise. Pastorius also wrote the Germantown Silva in the Beehive, a whole series of meditations in verse that spans training for the soul and all the way to poetic commentary on world affairs. By reading some of his poetry very soon, I will argue that this is one of the sections in which we most clearly see Pastorius's refusal to separate his pietist inclination toward private worship and humanism from his epic colonial ambitions and his sense of civic duty. And then my lecture will end with a discussion of the longest section of the Commonplace book, which contains hundreds of pages and at least 6,000 encyclopedic entries on a variety of religious, historical, political, and geographic topics. As we get deeper into the manuscript, I want to quickly answer two questions, two of the top FAQs that come up whenever people encounter the Beehive. Why does Pastorius write so much about Quakers? And why does Pastorius write so much about bees? So one of the most standard features of Commonplace books, which does appear in the Beehive, is a list of books that Pastorius read or knew. Unusually, though, Pastorius's book list is, for much of the manuscript, organized into two categories. As you can see on top, books that are written by Quakers, and by non-Quakers, and on the bottom, books that are written by Quakers. So we've established that there's always sort of an intimacy between pietists and Quakers, felt most strongly perhaps by those pietists who joined William Penn's Holy Experiment, but you still might be wondering why Pastorius had such a powerful investment in Quaker writings and ideas. Now, various biographers of Pastorius have suspected that he converted, but we have no proof of that claim. There are perhaps more precise explanations for Pastorius's affinity for Quakers. As Patrick Urban writes, Pastorius's letters back to Germany from Pennsylvania indicate that the lawyer, quote, valued intellectual and spiritual consanguinity over national affiliation in the construction of community in Pennsylvania. Also, Pastorius and William Penn bonded over both a common vocabulary of spiritual renewal and a common desire to connect over their knowledge of classical languages and literatures, what Urban calls, quote, the cosmopolitan heritage of the late Renaissance that Penn and Pastorius shared. That Pastorius found in his Quaker companions an opportunity to embrace a collective intellectual and humanist endeavor as a complement to his spiritual transformation is also paralleled by the way that he found in the Quaker community of Pennsylvania a hunger for civic and political engagement that helped him satisfy his desire to depart from pietist quietism. Indeed, Pastorius's career in law, letters, and literary production in North America was characterized by a constant tension between removed ascetic husbandry and humanism and everyday engagement with the political affairs of his time. Placing the ostensibly solitary achievement of the Beehive in the context of its author's broader career immediately reminds us that we are by no means discussing a writer who was removed from civic affairs. In fact, a closer look at the Beehive demonstrates that even within the scope of private study and reading reflected in Pastorius's Commonplacing, he was always adapting the legacies of both the gymnasium humanist education and the pietist insistence on personal and interior reflection to prepare himself not only for a virtuous solitary life, but also for a life of political engagement. Indeed, Pastorius claimed that he saw his migration as an opportunity to escape the vanities of serving nobles as a lawyer in Europe in favor of what he called a, quote, godly and honest life. But we see that this godly and honest life always consisted of leadership in a new province that he viewed not really as a wilderness, as he said, but as a burgeoning locale in which he could bring together the cultivation of knowledge, the cultivation of nature, and the improvement of society and the human condition through political action. One of Pastorius's first engagements with Quaker politics came in 1688, when he became one of 4 signatories of the Germantown Quaker petition against slavery, which is written in his hand. He was, I believe, the primary author of its prose. Pastorius continued to write anti-slavery verse throughout his life. Of course, the author had a variety of interests motivating his anti-slavery advocacy. One was indeed a moral opposition to the violence of enslavement, guided by the golden rule from the Gospel of Matthew. That said, Pastorius's writings on slavery also consistently register that the pietists back in Germany were hesitant to migrate to a province with enslaved people, though uncertainty remains as to whether this indicates a consistent pietist moral stance against slavery, or, as seems evident in some letters, an anti-Black fear of living among enslaved Africans. That said, the Black presence in Philadelphia even precedes William Penn's charter, and according to the historian Catherine Gerbner, Penn's Quaker associate Benjamin Furley, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote a letter to Penn even before Pastorius and other Germans had moved to Pennsylvania, registering that Furley had already encountered pietist resistance to living in a province that had enslaved people. In any case, Pastorius, who was always trying to increase the German population of Philadelphia, viewed slavery as not only a moral emergency, but also as a practical impediment to his goals for Germantown's population growth. This level of leadership and responsibility that Pastorius assumed over the new Germantown borough, note that Germantown was administratively elevated to become Philadelphia's first borough in 1689, further indicates his level of civic engagement. I've called him the first administrator of Germantown a few times, and it's worth hovering for a moment over what that meant practically. In his introduction to a book on the records of the Corporation of Germantown in the 1690s, Jim Duffin lists Pastorius's many political positions in the borough, which included bailiff, committeeman, clerk, recorder, treasurer. In the late 1690s, he also became the headmaster of Philadelphia's Friends School, another fascinating connection to the Quakers. In 1701, when Germantown was still under Pastorius's leadership, residents drafted a petition to Penn that insisted on their autonomy from Pennsylvania and that they shouldn't have to pay taxes to the province. Gerbner, in fact, argues that this insistence on their autonomy may have in part been a reaction to William Penn's growing enthusiasm about Pennsylvania's role in the transatlantic slave trade, which expanded throughout the 1690s, a position that always alienated residents of Germantown, even though mainstream Quakers didn't escalate their own internal policies against slaveholding until 1776. I will also add that Pastorius's advocacy was often concerned with policy around taxation. Pastorius wrote an essay on taxes, arguing that any taxes collected to fund wars or as tithes were irreconcilable with Quaker beliefs. One can find, as often in the Beehive, that in the margins of this essay on taxation, which is on the screen, Pastorius connects each of his claims to a specific biblical reference in the margins. He also writes several entries specifically against tithes throughout the Beehive. As we continue to explore the Beehive, we'll find that Pastorius's entire humanist enterprise was a negotiation between his impulse for quietism and his impulse for civic engagement. But one of the motifs of his entire oeuvre, which indeed stands at the center and even informs the title of the Beehive, yes, we're about to get to bees, is the cultivation of a garden. Pastorius was a gardener and a beekeeper. To introduce this element of the Commonplace book, I will read to you a brief excerpt of poetry that Pastorius wrote in his Germantown Silva. Quote, "When one or other rambles to fishermen and shambles, for physics and for victuals, which they cut with their whittles, and play the dainty fops, then I go to my garden. Next sage with hyssop rises, preferred to those spices fetched from the east and west. My pen now waxing weary, I leave off to be airy. Short follies are the best." So Pastorius was not really that great of a poet. But anyway, this poem comes shortly after an epigraph quoting Horace in the manuscript, the great poet of civically engaged husbandry. We see in this poem I just read some evidence that the meditation on gardening emerges within the conditions of both self-aware empire building and luxury. In an article on Pastorius's view of nature, Shirley Hershey-Showalter argues that the poems like this one suggest that Pastorius preferred tending to his garden over tending to worldly affairs. But in this final section of my lecture, I will argue instead that two modes of writing in the Beehive, which are the poetic and the encyclopedic, serve in a distinctly 18th century way to posit the garden, and in turn the garden of knowledge, that is Pastorius's cultivated commonplace book, as a model for understanding and even preparing for participation in the rapidly changing world and the expanding empires of the Atlantic. Here, for instance, note that in the poem I just read, Pastorius critiques the luxury of fops, in part by suggesting that the simple joy of tending to one's garden is greater than the pleasure of consuming Eastern commodities. Yet even this juxtaposition, framing the garden in relation to the empire, demonstrates a familiar trope seen in much poetry that seeks to simultaneously celebrate the affluence that accompanies growing trade and empire, while warning against the moral decline that could accompany luxury. When I first began reading the Beehive, including the poetry of the Germantown Silva, I was struck by the way that Pastorius's writing, the poetry of a German who wrote mostly in English, follows some very similar patterns to the work of patriotic English poets of the 17th and 18th centuries who addressed similar tensions between the desire for a prosperous British Empire and the critique of decadence. Like his English contemporaries, Pastorius approached these questions in his writing using a neoclassical register, one that perhaps is most strongly influenced by Virgil. Pastorius loved Virgil. He admired his eclogues, the bucolic poems that granted him a vocabulary to enjoy the pleasures of idle retreat. Back in Germany, Pastorius always had a fondness for the ensemble of poets known as the Pegnitz Flower Society, major pastoral poets of Nuremberg. And as Anthony Grafton has noted, Pastorius's copy of the 1669 edition of Georg Horn's book on God and nature, called The Ark of Moses, or the History of the World, he includes a handwritten note in the margins, referring jokingly to Virgil's eclogues. But on the other hand, Pastorius admired Virgil's Aeneid, and even in some ways identified with it. One of Pastorius's emblematical recreations in the Beehive excerpts Aeneas's first account with Rome from Virgil's epic, alluding to a character who appeared often in Pastorius's various writings about his own encounter of Pennsylvania. And according to Pastorius's 1684 description of Pennsylvania, he wrote line 258 of book 6 of the Aeneid above his door in Germantown. And the transition of this line, provided in the Francis Daniel Pastorius Reader, is, quote, "A small house, but a friend to the good. Stay away, ye profane." Like many poets of the 17th and 18th century Atlantic world, Pastorius often meditated between these two apparently contradictory modes, the high epic imperial tenor of the Aeneid and the low bucolic pleasures of the eclogues. by turning to Virgil's middlebrow genre, the Georgic. The Georgic shared with the pastoral a close connection with the local and the land, but it had a unique tendency to categorize, catalog, and instruct. The Georgic mode of didactic and at times encyclopedic poetic catalogs about land use and labor was often invoked by poets hoping to elevate their own nations to prove through good husbandry the potential for imperial might. Pastorius maintained a rigorous emphasis on the cultivation of nature and a parallel emphasis on the cultivation of the soul and intellect, but one which always pointed outward. This ethos allowed him to instruct others and ultimately to situate Germantown in a larger political context that makes the Beehive much more than a solitary work of humanistic commonplacing. However, my identification of Pastorius as writing similarly to many patriotic English poets was confusing to me because I did not know what kind of patriotism could potentially be assigned to somebody like Pastorius. In fact, though, my impulse to read Pastorius in the same temper as these contemporary English or British poets who also fused the major Virgilian genres to simultaneously register pleasure, land use, encyclopedic cataloging, and even epic ambitions for empire, turned out to hold some water. Abraham Cowley, an English royalist who wrote an epic on the Civil War from his position of exile after the revolution of the 1640s, is one of the major 17th century poets who wrote an epic of the English nation that introduced numerous pastoral and Georgic elements. And Cowley features prominently in Pastorius's citations and in his celebratory verse. Interestingly, in one poem of the Germantown Silva, Pastorius declares his love for Cowley's verse as though he and Cowley were of one nation. He claims in his celebration of Cowley is equivalent to an Italian celebrating Virgil or Juvenal. And he quotes, I'll quote, "Let Italy or Latium praise Virgil and Horatium, their Lucan, Catul, Juvenal, and him whom we the long nose call. O Cowley does outrhyme them all." The Beehive's connection to the Georgics in particular is also quite tangible in certain ways, including that Book 4 of Virgil's Georgics begins by describing the lives of bees as a model for human society. When Pastorius writes about bees in his Commonplace book, he includes a list of important literary references to the insects, beginning with Aristotle, then turning to Virgil's Georgics, and then noting early modern humanists from Erasmus onward who centered the figure of the bee. Pastorius calls himself, quote, but a two-footed bee, writing a little poem to his readers, quote, "My friends, we see the laborious bee in gardens, orchards, fields, to seek and suck what yields a sweet and wholesome sap. Here she loves to tarry, and that juice to carry into her hive. Thus let us strive to imitate the same, accounting it a shame if we should fail to gather some good things for our reader." What is it about the bee that so inspired Pastorius, besides his own relationships to them as he was a beekeeper? Well, in this poem, we see that Pastorius describes the process of finding the best flowers and collecting the sap, almost like an alchemical process, one of collecting materials selectively and cultivating something greater, which the scholar can do with knowledge. Bees also, as Peter Stalybras has pointed out when he teaches this text, lack any sense of property lines. They will find the best flowers anywhere, just as Pastorius sometimes suspended his own biases in the Beehive to produce a pluralistic compendium of knowledge, even at the expense of pietist rigor. And also bees sting, and for Pastorius, so too must an intellectual with integrity. In his celebrations of English poets, for instance, he compares Daniel Defoe to a bee. Pastorius never knew Defoe as a novelist. Robinson Crusoe was published in 1719, which is the year that Pastorius died. But he was very familiar with Defoe's 1701 poem, The True-Born Englishman, a defense of William of Orange, whom Pastorius also admired, according to multiple entries of the Beehive on King William and his successful revolution to overthrow the Catholic King James II as the King of England in 1688. So on Defoe's poetry, Pastorius writes the following in verse, quote, Defoe had many foes for superfining things politically true. If bees were without stings, brave honeybirds, they would not be so tedious to that rash animal which we call anthropos. End quote. That all being said, Pastorius's connection to poetic modes like the Georgic extends beyond the verse he writes and into his entire conception of the beehive. As Palmieri has written, we see across the manuscript, quote, a shift in Pastorius's conception of the beehive as an encyclopedic project. So I will end this lecture by turning to the final section of Pastorius's Beehive, his catalog of organized terms which contain personal and scholarly reflections on a variety of historical, political, and spiritual subjects, with both excerpted texts and original meditations in prose, dense with citations to his vast library and cross-references throughout the manuscript. And this is also the most comprehensively indexed section of the Beehive. As Suvir Kal has written, understanding the encyclopedic quality of much 18th century writing, often infused with the Georgic tendency to catalog, helps us identify the imperial ambitions of even apparently descriptive writing. For Kal, we see that much 18th century poetry, for instance, quote, is far from the tone of evacuation and retreat that some critics of 18th century poetry have described as the temper of the period. Instead, much poetic vocabulary and method are defined by the poet's identification with broad and weighty themes, history, nation, empire, as indicated by a formal expansiveness, an inflation of poetic prospect and retrospect that makes such poems eclectic compendiums of poetic practice, poems in search of near encyclopedic, synthetic idiom adequate to the articulation of complex and wide-ranging ideas, themes, and values, end quote. I quote Kal at length here to argue that the formal expansiveness and aspiration to the near encyclopedia also similarly elevates Pastorius's commonplacing from a document of evacuation and retreat to an eclectic compendium suited for the consideration of history, nation, empire in a near encyclopedic idiom. We see this formal expansiveness and innovation most strongly in the final section of the Beehive, with which I will end. At the end of the Beehive, Pastorius fills more than 570 folio pages, with about 6,000 entries on topics of interest to him. This is the longest section of the Beehive, especially when we consider that many pages of it are missing. At the beginning of this section, Pastorius arranges his terms alphabetically, but quickly he runs out of space. As Palmieri has noted, Pastorius chose not to follow earlier models of commonplacing that often stuck to alphabetical ordering systems, but kept huge sections of blank space to add in new terms without breaking the alphabetical ordering. Pastorius didn't want to waste paper with blank space. Instead, he introduced a whole new organizational logic to his encyclopedic section, numerical ordering, which set the stage for the digital Beehive. Recent scholarship on commonplacing, including Whitney Trittine's work on Susanna Collette and Cassidy Holohan's digital version of Samuel Richardson's collection on moral sentiments, have argued that early modern commonplacing formed a pre-digital but proto-computational method for organizing knowledge. I would say that nowhere is that truer than in Pastorius's Commonplace book. Computers, as we know, don't need to organize information in a linear, orderly fashion, but have numerical protocols for turning jumbles of information into experiences that feel orderly for the user. Such is the same for Pastorius's method. He begins his encyclopedic section alphabetically. The screen currently shows his first 3 entries on absence, absurdity, and abundance. But his dense alphabetical section leaves limited space for additions, so Pastorius places his additions after the alphabetical section and then includes almost 5,000 topics arranged numerically. The numerical section begins with an entry on familiarity. But quickly Pastorius transitions, and I'm going to jump through it, to 492, dissenters, Number 1141, slavery, which is a continuation of an entry from the alphabetical section that cross-references forward to its numerical continuation hundreds of pages later. 1410 is Dr. Philip James Spina. Pastorius uses this section largely to document the history of pietism through its major figures. 1512 is Barbados. There's a whole section where Pastorius goes through various islands. Number 2090 is alchemy. Number 4802 is Abraham Cowley. There's usually no apparent rhyme or reason for why Pastorius places any numerical entry in the place where he does. One section of the upper 1000s goes from elephants to atheism to vineyards to China. And when read in this dense manuscript form, this section is really difficult to navigate. But when one learns how to follow Pastorius's system of cross-references, page references, and indexing, you find that working outward from the final encyclopedic section of the manuscript can actually take one on comprehensible paths through Pastorius's thought processes, bridging the huge ideas, his reading and studies, and his impulse to make connections between issues and themes he deemed relevant, demonstrating how this massive manuscript built of moving parts seems to have been the result of rigorous, orderly intellectual work by Pastorius. Our work at the Digital Beehive has sought to make the anatomy, capacity, and navigability of Pastorius's encyclopedic writing realized on an accessible digital interface. For all 5,000 plus extant entries in his encyclopedic section, you will find in the Digital Beehive individual clickable entries. We can take, for instance, 1312, witchcraft. You can and should read through this huge, dense text with everything that Pastorius commonplaces here about witchcraft in his own hand. It's very anti-Catholic. But then you scroll and see our digital annotation of all the key information that Pastorius gives us within the entry to send us around the manuscript and around a visualization of his own thought process. So at the end of this entry, you'll see, for instance, that he writes, add number 1316. So we've realized this cross-reference as a hyperlink to 1316 Laplanders, which you can click on. This refers to the Sami peoples native to Northern Europe. And it would bring you here. Then back at the entry for witchcraft, we might also note that at the very bottom, there's a reference to page 375 of the manuscript in the last line of the entry, which also includes a list number 39. So we've provided a link to that page, 375, which brings you to one of Pastorius's book lists. And if you look to number 39 of the book list, you find John Beaumont's 1705 Historical, Physiological, and Theological Treatise of Spirits, Apparitions, Witchcrafts, and Other Magical Practices that's commonplaced in this section. Finally, our links also take you to the entry in Pastorius's Octavo Index, and this is an entry where all the different sections on witchcraft are listed. And from there, you can zoom out to the full page of W's and Y's in the index, and you can navigate back to any of these individual encyclopedic entries that interest you. So we hope then that the Digital Beehive will give you an opportunity to learn not just about Pastorius, but about the temper of writing Quakerism, Pietism, knowledge production, settlement, and even empire in early Philadelphia. And in so doing, we hope you see how this buzzing hive contains a trajectory through a man's mind, his spiritual transformation, a new borough in the city that many of us on this call consider home, a growing empire, and an entire world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this wonderful talk. Giving us some much needed, much appreciated context. Historically, politically, religiously, for Pastorius, and then ending so wonderfully showing the kind of potential of this digital project. We have a little bit of time for questions, so please feel free, as Lynn has just said in the chat, to type questions or to raise your hand, and we can read the question out loud, or you can unmute. I was wondering, maybe just to start off, Peter, if you could talk about, you know, the digital project in the sense of like what, you know, what a future version of it might be, or what kind of potential questions could be answered currently, and what, you know, a future with maybe some kind of AI technology or some sort of, you know, add on to the current project that might not be feasible right now because of time constraints or budget constraints. But just to talk about like some kind of blue sky thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you. That is something I've thought a lot about, because I mean, I'll say what what I think, I hope you all go to the Digital Beehive. I saw that Jesse posted that in the chat. What it currently is really, you know, I had this conversation with John Pollock recently, like, what does the Digital Beehive currently let you do? And the answer is it lets you read the Beehive, and it lets you navigate through it more easily, and it lets you go through annotations. But what that doesn't necessarily do is bring people who otherwise wouldn't be searching for this, at this point, you know, relatively obscure commonplace book to it. So, you know, one of the hopes that I have for this site, which may in fact result in doing some work on like a companion to what I see now as really being like just the sort of digital and somewhat annotated version, would be to kind of have a more sort of public facing companion to it that makes the case really for the study of Pastorius in Philadelphia, and which provides sort of more kind of entry points for people who may want to study or teach things around this text, but who wouldn't otherwise find it. And in addition, you know, the other thing that I have sort of, that we have a lot of resources for, and is just, or a lot of the work done for us by Lyman Riley, who many of you know is the former curator for cataloging and special collections here, who did an amazing work kind of reconstructing all these many book references. You know, Pastorius had the biggest library in Philadelphia before James Logan. And some of his books are in the Library Company of Philadelphia. Some of his books, like, no one really knows what they are. We don't have any copies of them anywhere, but their titles are written out. But I think it would be, I want to see how far we could go in kind of reconstructing what he read as sort of a massive kind of project about book collecting in Philadelphia, which I think will lead us, because right now all that cross-referencing we do is not outward to other texts, it's just internal cross-references, like, but those are typically within, you know, huge networks of references to a vast library that I think we could do more to kind of help people visualize and understand. Yeah.
Exciting. Thank you. I see we have a hand raised from Molly Young. Molly, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay.
Oh. All right. Well, I'm not sure if maybe we'll move to the next question. We have a question in the chat from Hao Tianhu. Do you have any plan to provide transcriptions of the CPB for the Digital Beehive project?
Could someone tell me what CPB?
Not sure what that.
Oh, yeah.
We might get that in the chat, and we also have a question from Lila Goldenberg.
Oh, the
Commonplace book.
Wow, I've been working on a Commonplace book and have never even thought to. I would have taken so much time of my last year if I started abbreviating the words Commonplace book. So that is a project that, to me, you know, feels of an incredibly large scope. We would probably need to be able to hire a large team of people to start working on that. I don't know if we have the resources to do that at this time. I know that, you know, there was a professor whose name is escaping me right now. If someone knows it, feel free to throw it in the chat, from Duke, who was for many years working on an actual edition of this of the Beehive with transcriptions, and quite dramatically, he died in the process. So you know, it is something which I think would be, you know, and when Nick brings up oh, thanks, John put it down in the chat. And when Nick brings up, AI, I mean, the extent to which like there is ever going to be resources for reading 18th century handwriting well with AI is like, I think, an open question. Currently, like most efforts to OCR using AI is hard, but yes, there are. I see crowdsourcing, and one of the things I talked about when I was applying for my current DH fellowship is that a lot of 18th century edition building, not necessarily through transcription, but I'm thinking of something like the recent digital edition of James Granger's Sugarcane or a few others have used open sourcing, and we know a lot of people in this area who've done like open source transcription projects about all kinds of letters and things. So I'd be very interested in potentially looking into possibilities like that. Yeah, and to answer the thing that just came up about crowdsourcing to identify books involved, I think like most of the books have been identified by title. The bigger question is this a book that still exists in the world with all the information we know about it? That's a kind of crowdsourcing that might involve reaching out to like many archives and things like that. Probably not one that will come from people's general knowledge, although you never know. So yeah.
And we have a question from Lila Goldenberg, who thanks you for this wonderful talk. And she writes, it seems to me like your project can offer scholars greater insight into their own work. I'm curious in particular if Pastorius came into contact with indigenous people and what he said about them.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So yes, he did, and unfortunately, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about this in the talk, and unfortunately, that was one part that I cut for time. So one of the texts that's read a lot by from Pastorius, it's translated. This was something I think he did write in German, but which is translated in the Francis Daniel Pastorius Reader, which is a great resource that through Penn Libraries also has virtual access. He did write a section on encounters that acknowledges the Lenape treatises with Penn and kind of gives the William Penn narrative of sort of that everyone came out well from that. And so and then in addition to but besides that, his narrative, which is sort of his ethnographical narrative, is one that I think about as similar to what we see actually from some like kind of elite and royalist settlers or people who've written travel writing or things on early America, including Thomas Morton and Aphra Behn, which is trying to fold in a sort of idealized image of indigenous people to the critique of luxury by implying that the nations he encountered here had not overturned the kinds of virtues that he had seen come apart in Europe. So we see that as sort of a rhetorical move that he makes in some of his more kind of on the ground writings about Pennsylvania and Germantown. There are small references to indigeneity throughout the encyclopedic section, but those are not great. Those are, in sections on the Caribbean, for example, talking about cannibalism and things like that.
We have a question from Stephen Peitzman. Says, I lived in Germantown most of my adult life, and I'm still close by. Do you have thoughts about how the efforts and thoughts of Pastorius shaped early Germantown as it grew and evolved as a place?
This is a great question that I wish I knew more about. There's a recent dissertation by, is it Miranda Moat? I think maybe the name of the student. Correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. But which thinks about Pastorius's gardening and his kind of shaping of the landscape of Germantown, which I think largely has been taken off of the kind of literal map. Like he lived at 25 East High Street, but I don't think his original house and garden is still standing there. There is a house on Germantown Avenue, which came from, I think his grandson, built in the mid to late 17th century. But I think now there is like a sort of in Germantown, a kind of idealization of his legacy that sometimes comes, that image that was on the screen for a while of like the Pastorius community garden refers to the way that he's that his name has been sort of continued to be a kind of icon of the notion of sort of collective agricultural pursuit. There's a Pastorius Park, but that has nothing to do with his lifetime. That was opened in Chestnut Hill in early, I think in like 1915, as a kind of tribute to him. In terms of the kind of link there, though, like how we went from his lifetime to the sort of contemporary legacy today, I would be very interested in learning more about that. And will be in touch. And hopefully, that's one of the ways when I think about kind of more public facing work and justifying the study of Pastorius in Philadelphia. That's one of the ways that I think is going to be available to us, is thinking about how he persists in the infrastructure of Germantown and Mount Airy and Chestnut Hill.
We have a hand raised from our colleague and friend, John Pollock. John, do you want to ask away?
Peter, hi everybody. Thanks, Nick. Peter, thank you so much. I don't want to take too much else time from the other great questions, but I wanted to congratulate you. It's a brilliant essay, and for some of us here who've been thinking about, Mr. Complicated, Wacky Pastorius for many years, you have a lot to teach us, and it's great. I think that you're going to be able to inspire a lot of new work. You're doing it yourself, and you will inspire others. And so that's really exciting. And there's a lot to digest in what you've given us, but let me just try something to see if I can get at some of the arc of your work here, because your summary of pietism and Pastorius in it was amazing. But of course, you move us to an Anglo-centric space later in your talk. Obviously, Pastorius writing in English, but it's kind of serious engagement with an English literary world, which to me feels pretty new and innovative in what you're saying. And I think that's exciting. And I guess a question I would have, not to sound too English department here, but is it an either or? I mean, and can you see through the Beehive Pastorius kind of taking an increasing distance from that humanistic pietism place from which he started, and moving to a kind of different Anglophilic centric space later in his life, later in this manuscript, or later in his Germantownness? Is it from one to the other thing? Is it a layering on in this guy's copious mind? I don't know. Any thoughts about that kind of complicated shift, if it is one from Germanness to Englishness? Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's a great question. I like that way of that's something I will think about for a long time, because what I'm writing about right now, just for that insider info, is the sort of English literary connection, because I'm interested in how that particular moment of English literary history, with Cowley, with Denham, with others who appear in the who are commonplaced here, how that was a really sort of living literary discourse in early America. In terms of, the two way, because I don't think I want to talk about it like some kind of shift or like something was abandoned. When you said layering on, what that made me think of is the sense of like elevating the English, perhaps somewhat for practical purposes. As much as I argue that this is a really sort of grand social project, this also really is this kind of gift to his sons, who I think he really wants to pass on this kind of legacy in English. But this kind of elevation of them, by the same way, I don't think he writes much about Milton. But I think sometimes about this period of literary history, how Milton is one of the writers that really gets put on the map as someone whose work can be read and elevated and commonplaced in a manner that puts English literature on the map in a way that has previously been reserved for sort of higher literary languages. So I think it's a matter of elevating, not a matter of supplanting, that we see with his sort of fetish for these English writers. And then what does confuse or interest me though is, because like what I don't think we really see much of here is any sense of like German patriotism. So this patriotic discourse that I talk about, it most closely aligns him with the sort of anthemic English patriotism of this poetry. And that moment in the poem on Cowley that I quoted, where there's that kind of syllogism, like, or that sort of analogy, like I am to Cowley as the Italians are to their writers, it implies that there's almost this kind of desire to put himself on the map of this English patriotic poetic discourse that was a major part of kind of British imperial history of the early nascent element of it. So that's what's confusing and interesting to me, because is there an abandonment of the German context? Definitely not. But is there an English kind of patriotism that is totally separate from any of what we see about his relationship to Germanness? I do think there is in this text.
That's great. We go from the parochial beehive writer squirreled away in a tiny corner to a global beehive, and I think that's what you're giving us. That's pretty cool. And way to go, Abraham Cowley. Who knew? We should all get out our copies. Thanks, Peter.
And Peter, I think we have time for maybe one more question here, and we have one from Tony Bowers that forwarded by Lila Goldenberg. Hi, Peter. Thank you for all you've taught us today. You mentioned Pistorius' library, which reminded me of a question I had more than once while you spoke. You repeatedly referred to books that Pistorius read or knew, and books that he read or studied. Do these usages telescope differences across his reading practices? And can you tell whether he read all of his many books? Was he a book collector as much as a reader? Good question.
Yeah, this is a great question, and is one that I think does probably require a little bit of speculation to answer. His letters, which are currently in held, I think, in the Philadelphia Historical Society, are include the kind of labeling of certain books that he refers to, with like names of the people who actually owned them. So in terms of, he was both a book collector and I think also the friend who borrows books and never gives them back. He would write, he and Logan only crossed over a certain amount, but he has books that on his list just have like Logan next to them and things like that. So I do think that there was a sense, I don't think that he read all of the books in this manuscript, in part because I think that may be impossible based on the scope of references here. I think that part of the kind of I think certainly he was incredibly well read. I think he was also very interested in emotive cataloging that didn't necessarily demand all of that reading. And I think finally, in the sort of model of the bee that he describes, when I think about what kind of scholarly practice that describes, I don't necessarily think that it describes the constant like temporality of like sustained engagement with a single text. I think that it does imply that he probably did a lot of excerpt reading. He's really into epigraphs and emblems and names and moments like that. So I think a lot of his commonplacing probably involved reading for that level. And whether that happened with some books that weren't actually read closely, I think is quite likely. But he did own many books. That is true. And I wish we had all of them, but we only have many of them. Yes. Thank you.
Peter, we're about at time, and I think we should probably stop there. We do have a couple more questions in the chat about Pistorius's family name and the graphic layout of the physical text. Yes. Maybe if you have a couple of minutes, we could answer that last question. That seems really exciting as a question and as something to think about. The graphic layout of the physical text and how the digital Beehive creates its own version of this formatting. Is the question from Jacob Myers. He says, I noted that in one of your slides, Pistorius calls the entries as honeycombs, a distinctly geometrical natural emblem. And I'm struck by how the entries section creates its own honeycomb. So are there any other ways in which the project engages with the graphic or table elements of this text and their visual epistemology?
Well, that's a great question. And I take it almost as a suggestion because I think the answer to that is what you've seen is more or less the extent to which we've reformatted. I think that so there are the two ways to navigate the digital Beehive, as you saw on the screen, and I can try to bring us back there, are the contents tab. God, I have so many slides. The contents tab and the browse entries tab. So the contents tab is where you get what you currently see on the screen, which is the pages, whereas the entries tab is where you get this, which are the entries that, as you say, do take segments of pages and kind of create new shapes and new organizational structures for them. This is the only section that we've done that for, but you also saw a few moments, the family tree, other moments documenting, different organizations of writing styles that, when we would encounter them during our process of doing this, because sometimes they're dispersed within this section, he's not super faithful to kind of section division. We'd always sort of think like, what do we do with this page? So I think that the model that we have now, which is essentially using a Mirador viewer to draw boxes around distinct entries and, exporting them into these, can definitely be something that I'd be interested in thinking visually more creatively about, especially if we do more deduction of entries from full pages, and if we decide to do some of the pages that have themselves more ambitious layout styles. So I would love to talk to you more about that, Jacob, because I appreciate that you observed that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. This has been a really rich 90 minutes. Thank you for the presentation. And again, we hope to see many of you at our next big event in November, the Schoenberg Symposium for Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age, November 16th to 18th in Philadelphia and online. And please sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already, in order to get notifications about many future lectures as well. So let's thank Peter again, and wish everyone a nice afternoon, nice day, and we'll see you soon.